Hi, good morning, and welcome back to the Florida Keys History and Discovery Center. We're here for our Tuesday morning Facebook Live talk, where we're going to discover some history. And today I thought we would talk about how I discovered Florida Keys history, which relates to what I'm standing in front of, our coral reef exhibit. When I first moved to the Florida Keys in 2001, I had moved here to write my great Florida novel and had no real interest in the local history, just had no real interest in history at all. But as I was doing my research for my first book, which was a snorkeling guide to Florida, every dive captain I would go out with would have a different story about how this reef got its name and how that reef got its name. And it struck me, and I got curious about where the names for these coral reefs came from, and some of the stories and the lore behind the coral reefs. And one of the reefs in particular that really prompted me and got me going into talking about history and learning about history was a reef called Pickle's Reef in Key Largo. And a really interesting reef. If you're not familiar with it, there are structures, concrete structures down on the bottom of the ocean in that area that are thought to have come from pickle barrels. So there are these pickle barrel shaped reefs, or these pickle barrel shaped structures, and they were actually barrels that were filled with concrete that during a shipwreck at some point were jettisoned overboard and settle on the bottom. The wooden staves of the barrels slowly rotted away, and what was left behind was this concrete that had set and to form these barrel-like structures, and there are dozens of them, or at least there were, on the floor of that reef area, in that reef area. And so it became known, as the story goes, that it was called Pickle's Reef. Now, in some dive captains would say that that the pickle barrels fell over during the Civil War when they're transporting this concrete down to Fort Jefferson or Key West or some other area. But what I found out in my research, as I slowly began to wonder about this reef, that the name Pickle's Reef actually dates back to the earliest shipwreck, to the early 1820s, long before the Civil War, long before these barrel-shaped objects were actually on the ground there. And what's interesting about this particular reef was that one of the coral structures that are prominent, or back in the day were once prominent at this reef, were pillar corals. And if you were a seaman and you were wrecked on that reef, or you were sailing by and looking down through the crystal clear water, what you would have seen were these giant, these large pillar structures growing up from the bottom. And if you're looking down on these pillar corals, they kind of look like pickles. And that's kind of where I think the earliest name came from. Now, over the years, what are the odds of pickle barrels, of all the thousands of coral reefs, what are the odds of pickle barrels actually falling, or barrels, they call them pickle barrels because back in the old days, you'd go into your mercantile shop and there would be a barrel full of pickles that you could eat. One moment, please, rudely. And but it's very interesting that that of all the reefs, that these barrels happen to fall and settle in an area already called Pickle's Reef. Now there is some disagreement about where those structures came from. There's even the idea that perhaps this was concrete that was being loaded, that was being shipped on a barge, maybe after the 1935 hurricane. There's no real consensus about how old those barrel structures are, or where indeed they came from. But every dive captain had a story. It intrigued me. I began looking it up, looking at these histories of shipwrecks in the Florida Keys, and lo and behold, I came upon a shipwreck that was sunk at a Key Largo reef named Pickles Reef, dating back to, I believe, 1823, which really kind of opened the door for me to really begin to discover history. So what happened was I became curious and began looking at more history and learning about it. And then I stumbled upon a really cool website, keyshistory.org, and found this great website filled with all this information. And this was the first time that I learned about Jerry Wilkinson, who was the president of the Historical Preservation Society of the Upper Keys, legendary local historian. And so I began to look at his page and then look at other documents and kind of learn about the local history. And then I began writing about it, because at the end of the day, that's what I love to do, is write. And so I wrote what I called Sketches of Isla Morada, where I was kind of giving my take on some of the history. And I sent him an email with this document, and he responded, and that began a 10-year-long friendship. And that was the door that opened me to writing several books, a couple with Jerry and columns in local newspapers, and ultimately ended up with me becoming the curator here at the Florida Keys History and Discovery Center, which has been a really interesting roads fork. And one day I'm writing fiction and writing a novel, and next, I happen into a snorkeling book, quite by accident. Very pleased to get my first book deal with the University Press of Florida, and then that door opens up this whole new world for me. And I became really entrenched and intrigued by the local history. And the more I learned, the more I wanted to learn. And the more I learned and wanted to learn, the less I found out that I knew. So, every door opens up a new door, and there's more information coming in and more information coming in. And what really becomes evident after looking into the history and learning more is that while the Florida Keys are really a series of islands linked together, for this instance by the Overseas Highway, first Flaggers Railroad, then the highway, it really is one long story. It's one. They really aren't. They're separate islands, but the history and the culture and everything. It's really an intricate weave of this delicate fabric of history that really is connected. Key West is connected to Key Largo and all the islands in between, and all these stories and all these families that have descendants littered up and down the island chain. It really is one large Monroe County, Florida Keys family, which is really amazing, and which is why I'm so happy I got really involved in learning about the history. Yes, Aaron, you have a question.
Michael would like to know, what is your favorite book you have written?
My favorite book that I've written is always going to be the book I'm working on right now. I have 3 book projects underway right now, and I am one who always wants to do better the next time. And like my first book, Snorkeling Florida, lots of mistakes, lots of history mistakes. I wasn't into the history. I was just kind of playing at that point. And the more I learn, the better stories I can tell. So for me, always the next book is going to be better. The next book is better. And I'm working on 2 books of Florida Keys stories that are really much lengthier and much more involved, and really linking all these separate pieces of history and kind of linking them together. So for me, it's always the next book I'm working on, because that's what I'm excited about most. I hate reading what I've already written, because all I see are mistakes and bad sentences and how I could do this better, how I could do that better. So my next book is always the book I am most fond of. Snorkeling the Florida Keys is kind of my gateway book. My follow-up to Snorkeling Florida was a snorkeling guide to the Florida Keys, and what I pitched to my publisher was a snorkeling guide to Florida, and what I delivered to them really was a history of several reefs, of a series of reefs between Key Biscayne and Key West National Park, and the Dry Tortugas, and that was probably for me the first fun really history, me really getting into the history. So I think of all the books that I've written, Snorkeling the Florida Keys is a snorkeling guide to the Florida Keys filled with lots of history about how the reef got its name and the wrecks that happened on that on that wreck or on that reef. So that's probably my favorite book of the ones that I have written. But the next book I come out with will be my next favorite, and I'm really excited about the next 3 or 4 years. We'll have at least 3 books coming out. One probably in March, which is not really history related, but it's got a lot of history in it. I'm taking a little departure, but it's. I love to write. I love to tell stories, and the more I learn, the better stories I tell. So for me, it's always the next book I'm going to write. Now, we do have a great presentation coming up on Wednesday, all about the coral, the baby boom, sexual reproduction's role in reef restoration, with Dr. Hannah Cook, who's going to come down, or with Mote Marine Laboratory, it's going to be a look at coral reproduction and how the corals are struggling in the wild to reproduce out of the reef line. So please sign up for that. You can find a link on our keyshistory.com page, on our Facebook page. There are several links there. Please sign up. It's going to be a great, really interesting, great topic. It's from 6 to 7 on Wednesday, November 11th. It's free to our members, $5 for non-members. We hope to see you.
Give that website one more time.
keysdiscovery.com. I'm a little rusty. It's been a few weeks since I've been out here. But I'm glad to be back and looking forward to many more weeks of bringing you more insights into the local history. And I hope you guys had a safe tropical storm. We lost a tree in our yard. Apparently, we're one of the few houses in the Alamorada area who actually had a little damage. But I'm glad to be back. I'm glad that there's some blue out there in the sky, and we'll see you. It's sort of blue out in the sky right now. But we hope to see you Wednesday night, and if not, I will see you back here on Tuesday. You guys have a great day. Thanks so much.